Hello, welcome. Thank you everyone for joining today. As many of you know, this month marks the 20th anniversary of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security. This is a historic and overdue acknowledgement of the disproportionate and unique impact of armed conflict on the health, safety and human rights of women and girls. It was pivotal in explicitly recognizing the contributions women make in conflict prevention, in peacekeeping and peace building, and their pivotal role in peace and security. 9 additional Security Council resolutions and 20 years later, member state commitments toward these resolutions deepen as the UN offers more detailed guidance to its peace operations in the with women, peace and security mandates, including on conflict-related sexual violence or CRSV. Today, the permanent mission of the United Kingdom to the United Nations Department of Peace Operations and Center for Civilians in Conflict would like to welcome you to the virtual launch event of CIVIC's new report, We Have to Break the Silence Somehow, Preventing Conflict-Related Sexual Violence Through UN Peacekeeping. Today, we'll discuss the impacts of conflict-related sexual violence on individuals and communities, and as part of broader peace and security strategies. We'll specifically highlight the good practices and challenges of this work for UN peacekeeping operations in the Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of Congo, and South Sudan. We'll also discuss what a survivor-centered approach to CRSV should look like and what more needs to be done to improve this work. We realize this is one among many, many events this month commemorating this significant landmark, and we really are so grateful for your time to have you join us this morning for an informed discussion on this very important topic. Before we begin, there are a few technical pieces of information for today's webinar. First, we'd like to ask everyone to keep your microphone muted at all times, except when or if you decide to take the floor. If you do take the floor for a question or as a speaker, please kindly use a headset with a microphone connected to your computer or phone. Second, the raised hand function will not be used today. If you do have a question, please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. And here you have 2 choices. You can either type your question in the Q&A function, which we can read for you. That's if you're feeling shy. You can post these at any time during the event, or you can write in the Q&A function that you have a question with the subject listed, please, so we know how to direct it. When we call on you to ask a question, your mic will be unmuted. We ask that you please keep your questions brief to allow more people to participate and speak at a moderate pace for the interpreters. Third, please click on the interpretation icon at the bottom lower right of your Zoom window and select either French or English channel and remain on that channel throughout the event. Please make sure to select the mute original audio at the bottom of this interpretation menu to hear only English or only French. Otherwise, you might hear both. There's a small background noise. Could I ask our interpreters to please share these last 2 points about interpretation in French? Thank you so much. I'd now like to turn the floor over to Ms. Carolyn Quinn, First Secretary of Peacekeeping in Africa from the Permanent Mission of the United Kingdom to the United Nations. Carolyn, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Wendy, and good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be here on behalf of the UK mission to the UN for the launch of this important event, not least because conflict-related sexual violence and its prevention is and remains a UK priority. I think we're the only government in the world to have a Prime Minister's Special Representative on preventing sexual violence in conflict and a dedicated policy team and funding dedicated to tackling CRSV. We're very proud of that, although it would be great if other governments would wish to join us in setting up similar positions. And our objectives in this really include strengthening justice for survivors and ensuring that perpetrators are held to account, supporting survivors and children born of conflict-related sexual violence in practical ways and in tackling the immense stigma they still face, and in preventing CRSV. And since 2012, when the UK launched the Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict initiative, we've committed over $59 million to that cause to support over 85 projects in 29 countries around the world. And most recently in June of this year, Her Royal Highness the Countess of Wessex and Lord Ahmad of Wimbledon, our Minister for the UN, launch global consultations on the draft Murad Code on documenting CRSV for global consultations. And what we hope to achieve with that code is to ensure safer, more effective and more ethical investigations into sexual violence crimes in conflicts. The code will promote international standards for recording those crimes in a survivor-centered way. It will aim to prevent further traumatization of survivors, whether by their interactions with governments, international organizations, civil society actors. It will reinforce the importance of evidence collection and of strengthening justice and accountability. And that code is still open for consultations until December of this year, and we hope to finalize and launch it in 2021. More broadly, in terms of protection of civilians, the UK has recently reaffirmed our commitment to mainstreaming POC. We've published the UK's approach to POC paper, which builds on our 2010 POC strategy. And in peacekeeping, of course, we work alongside our partners in the Security Council to try to ensure that all peacekeeping missions operate in a gender-sensitive way, and that their mandates are written in such a way that they recognise and have at their centre the disproportionate impact of conflicts on women and girls. We're very proud to support DPO through practical projects with extra budgetary funding that try to monitor and improve the impact missions are having on delivery of their mandates on the ground, through better data collection, analysis and reporting, including the CPAS, the Comprehensive Performance and Assessment System. So I'm very pleased that CIVIC's report, among other things, looks at the importance of data collection and data analysis and data-driven performance improvements in the area of tackling sexual violence in conflict. We're very proud to deploy UK personnel in key positions in peacekeeping missions, such as the role of the Gender and Protection Advisor in MINUSCO. And of course, the WPS agenda, including preventing and tackling CRSV, is a core element of the training we provide to all of our peacekeepers, but also to the thousands of peacekeepers from partner countries that we train every year across Africa. And sadly, that training remains all too relevant, given the very high prevalence of sexual and gender-based conflict, violence in the conflict settings where peacekeepers are deployed. And I think, sadly, we can be only too sure that the 332 cases MINUSCA verified last year, the 224 cases UNMISS verified, and the 27 cases that MINUSMA verified of sexual violence in conflict really represent just the tips of much bigger icebergs. So I want to just finish by paying tribute to the vital work that these three missions, including the colleagues we have on the line today, are doing to prevent women and girls from this scourge, alongside civil society partners who are really indispensable, including the Mukwege Foundation. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing today from them about how they are dealing with conflict-related sexual violence on the front lines, but also from my dear friend Rania and from Lauren on the findings of this important new report and to a really fruitful interactive discussion. So that's quite enough from me, and back over to you, Wendy. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Caroline. You certainly raise a number of points which will come up in today's discussion around accountability, around the importance of WPS agenda training, and the importance of bringing this really right the way through the guidance and training that is done throughout the system. And the UK has certainly been a lead in this regard. I'd like now to introduce our speakers for today. First is Ms. Rania Dagash-Kamara, Chief of Policy and Best Practices in the Department of Peace Operations, and she'll be followed by Ms. Lauren Spink, Senior Global Researcher, Center for Civilians in Conflict, and the lead author of this report. Thanks so much, and Rania, over to you.
Thank you very much, Wendy, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to join Wendy and Carolyn today for the launch of CIVIC's report in preventing conflict-related sexual violence through UN peacekeeping. And I'd like to welcome all of you and extend a warmer welcome yet to our colleagues, of course, from our missions. And building on what Carolyn has said, I would like to very much applaud CIVIC's identification of the role of UN peacekeeping in preventing conflict-related sexual violence, because it's a critical mandate, one that many allies on this call support and many more neglect. And we think it's really important that we continue to echo and increase the visibility on this mandate and the importance of its implementation. And we also are really owe you a lot of gratitude for the report findings, which, even though they were done before a lot of our work on the policy and handbook launch, actually echoes exactly some of the findings that are there, and the report findings contribute to improving our own efforts in improving peacekeeping performance with respect to the implementation in our 5 mandated missions. And before I make the 2 or 3 points I have today, I would like to tell you a story. I come from a culture that tells stories, and that's how we make our points. So I'll tell you the story of Marie. For those of you that know it, so be it. For those that don't, it's a reminder so you don't forget or neglect this mandate and its importance. Marie is a mother of 6. And Marie was living peacefully in her village when she was attacked by, well, the village was rather attacked by armed groups in a reprisal attack. And she was subjected to sexual violence. She was abducted and repeatedly raped. She finally did manage to escape and had to walk 130 kilometers to find a UN peacekeeping base. And what the UN then did with Marie is we did manage to transfer her for medical care and onto a local NGO for psychosocial support and literacy training. What is fascinating in Marie's story is that she now works on conducting outreach and referrals, and her exceptional journey from victim to activist shows what is possible when timely and appropriate support is made available. Her story echoes the experience of thousands of women, of girls, of men and boys in conflict-affected regions of the world each year. And I want to emphasize also the men and boys because they also get neglected and forgotten in this mandate. So it's really important we slavery and torture and other forms of sexual violence are used as weapons of war and terror throughout. And the impact of this, as many of you know, is long-term on individuals, it's long-term on communities, and it's long-term on societies. We've long recognized CRSV as peace and security issue and is a priority, of course, for the United Nations and peace operations. Marie's story also illuminates some of the work peacekeeping missions and their partners do in preventing and responding to CRSV and promoting the recovery and empowerment of survivors. Our missions carry out a wide range of multidisciplinary work coordinated across civilian, military, and police components in partnership with a range of actors. As Caroline was saying, it's host countries, it's civil society, where a lot of the anchor is, and it's UN agencies. Preventive action, including use of force, building a national capacity to prevent and respond to CRSV, including work with justice and security institutions, helps to bring an end to the impunity and to empowering survivors. I think in line with this survivor-centered approach, it's essential that victims and survivors' rights, dignity, and decisions are put at the center of our response to CRSV. I warmly welcome your remarks, Ms. Kabuo, during the discussion. This report also coincides with 4 milestones for us. As Wendy said, it's the 20th anniversary of 1325. 2020 is the first time that the UN Department of Peace Operations has launched policy and a handbook, so our guidance to missions on preventing and responding to CRSV. And we've done this closely with other partners in DPPA, OHCHR, and of course the Office of the SRSG. It's also the same year that the SG has made protection more broadly a key agenda that he intends to integrate and help define better across the UN system. And of course, 2020 is the year that our Department of Peace Operations is also looking and reviewing measures to improve our ability to respond to new and emerging threats and protecting civilians. So it coincides with a lot. And in closing, I just want to thank CIVIC once again for producing this report and highlighting the importance of a whole of mission approach, which is what our guidance to the missions has been about, and mainstreaming this approach to achieve effective implementation of the mandate. I look forward to the overview of the report and observations of our distinguished panel members, and thank you. Forgive me for taking slightly longer, Wendy.
Thanks so much, Rania. So many relevant points that you raise in the story that you said of Miriam is certainly one. I think that resonates with many people and is a real model for how a survivor-centered approach can really guide our work. Lauren, over to you to introduce the report and its key findings.
Hi, everyone. Really honored to have the chance to discuss some of these issues with you this morning. I am CIVIC Senior Global Researcher and the lead author on the report. And I'll briefly go over some of the highlights and findings of the report, but also leave plenty of time for conversation because we've got an incredible group of people on this line here, the Senior Women Protection Advisors from the 3 missions covered in the report, MINUSCA, MONUSCO, and UNMISS, and the Mukwege Foundation, some members of the Mukwege Foundation and survivors here to speak with us today as well. So as a starting point, CIVIC's peacekeeping program is focused on in-depth research on peacekeeping and protection of civilians in the DRC, the Central African Republic, Mali, and South Sudan. And then we link that research to advocacy and policy work at the international level. So this research project on conflict-related sexual violence really grew out of CIVIC's experience and observations in the field. For our researchers on the ground, it was clear that CRSV is not always happening where and when other types of violence take place. It is not always visible, and it is hugely underreported. So although CRSV is a part of the broader protection of civilians role that peacekeeping missions play, peacekeepers cannot assume that they are adequately or effectively addressing CRSV just because they are repositioning or carrying out a patrol or launching a dialogue to address other protection threats. And so this poses a real challenge for peacekeepers. Our research looked at that challenge and how missions are managing it. We assessed first whether missions have in place practices that would ensure they're collecting information on CRSV. For example, whether they're equitably engaging women and men in host nation communities, and whether staff understand that they should be reporting on this issue. Second, we looked at whether missions are able to identify hotspots and trends in CRSV and use that information to respond to it. And thirdly, we reviewed what challenges prevent UN peacekeepers from protecting civilians from CRSV. On that first point, whether missions are effectively and equitably engaging women and men on threats, we found that over the last several years, missions have put in place policies and target quotas for inclusion of women in early warning forums where they could potentially raise concerns about CRSV. So there is an understanding that women need to be included in these forums, in these early warning forums. But there are often barriers to the effective participation of women in these meetings. For example, women might be uncomfortable discussing CRSV around male community members, and these are often mixed meetings. They often have additional language barriers over men. And as the primary caregivers in many families, they might be unable to attend meetings that happen at specific times of the day when their caregiver responsibilities are heaviest. We found that some peacekeepers were aware of these barriers and taking steps to address them. However, this understanding was not widespread in the 3 missions we reviewed, and action to address these issues was ad hoc rather than institutionalized. So there's progress there, but still some additional progress that needs to be made. Also, most stakeholders agreed that having female peacekeepers deployed helps missions better engage women and girls on CRSV. I think this is something that we often hear. But it was clear from our research that having female peacekeepers does not automatically help. For example, missions are trying to deploy female engagement teams or mixed engagement teams. These are units of military peacekeepers that have a higher number of women in them than the average unit or company. But stakeholders who we interviewed made clear that these teams are really just a good photo opportunity if they don't have additional training on CRSV, if they aren't deployed to areas where missions suspect it is taking place, and if their reporting doesn't go to the right people in the mission for action. So, there's a lot more after women are deployed to peacekeeping missions that needs to happen to really make them an asset on countering CRSV. On information collection by missions overall, we found that they are increasingly collecting sex disaggregated data and information on CRSV, but that this role is still viewed primarily as the responsibility of the civilian and police sections of peacekeeping missions rather than the military sections. So I've been talking for a while about information collection on CRSV, but missions, there's often this fog of data. It's important not only that missions collect information, but that they can make sense of the information by looking at trends and identifying hotspots of sexual violence. And our research shows that in the missions we reviewed, the 3 missions, they are improving their analysis of trends. And these improvements are being driven by a few factors. First, the adoption of mission-wide incident tracking databases like SAGE. I think it makes sense that if you have these databases, you have an increased ability to analyze information on incidents and look at trends. And second, we found that the strengthening of the monitoring, analysis, and reporting arrangements, or the MARA in missions, the strengthening of the meetings, the MARA meetings, through the effort of the senior women protection advisors of these missions has really had an impact on improved ability to share information on threats and to look at patterns and perpetrators and trends in violations. I won't go into that too much since we have the senior women protection advisors from the 3 missions on the call today. So I think those are real improvements in looking at trends and hotspots, but we also found that even though databases are helping, there's really uneven use of these incident tracking databases and missions still. And also there are underlying tensions and issues in data sharing between humanitarians and peacekeepers that it is just really not easy to overcome. This requires strong guidelines at the field level that all stakeholders are aware of. And it just requires regular, consistent engagement between actors who are monitoring CRSV issues. So far I've been speaking primarily about internal processes. CIVIC also looked at the value add and impact of peacekeeping missions on conflict-related sexual violence, and we found that it was significant in some areas. Stakeholders were particularly appreciative of the awareness-raising role of the mission on CRSV, because this is, this makes communities recognize the rights that they have and can ensure there's less stigma for survivors who come forward. There was also strong appreciation of the human rights reporting role of missions and their work supporting civil society actors to work more safely on issues of CRSV themselves. There was appreciation for the advocacy role of missions on the release of abducted women, and also strong recognition of the important role that missions play supporting accountability for violations of CRSV, whether the perpetrators are parts of militias or the national army in the country where missions are deployed. I think there's a couple recent examples of this that are quite strong. the prosecution of National Army officials in the Ye area of South Sudan for rape. You know, the numbers of people prosecuted are relatively small, but that's a quite incredible precedent and a real victory in South Sudan. And you know, UNMISS really supported those prosecutions. Similarly, in DRC, the prosecution of the Rai Mutomboki, some Rai Mutomboki armed group leaders in Shabunda was strongly supported by MINUSCO, and this was part of a comprehensive action plan against CRSV that led to a 72% reduction in sexual violence in the area in the weeks and months after the action plan. So it's clear that there's a real impact of peacekeeping on CRSV, but despite these examples, you know, impact is limited by a number of factors, and we identified some of these in our research. First, action is not always comprehensive or coordinated like it was in the case of MINUSCO's response to sexual violence in Shabunda. Second, prioritization is uneven among staff. So stakeholders generally affirmed that CRSV is a priority for senior mission leadership, for senior civilian mission leadership, but that they don't always follow up on well-intended initiatives to keep them actively running. And third, we found that there's inconsistent support from military leadership, and this is really key. We encountered in our research examples of changes in high-ranking military officials, such as force commanders or sector commanders, that completely shifted the willingness of the military to proactively address issues like CRSV, for better and worse. So it shows that there needs to be more buy-in across high-ranking military peacekeepers. And fourth, missions are heavily relying on gender and CRSV specialists among their staff who are capacity strapped because, you know, because gender expertise is not yet mainstreamed across the peacekeeping staff. And that's I think primarily because of limitations in training for staff and the and prioritization of gender and CRSV during recruitment and staff evaluations. So really how that's brought into human resources. And finally, missions have gotten, you know, the 3 missions we reviewed have gotten, I think, much better at having accountability for internal processes, but still struggle to measure the impact of their activities for the population. So do patrols reduce conflict-related sexual violence? Did a dialogue forum prevent CRSV? Measuring these things is difficult, but hugely important. And I think missions have made progress toward that, but there's still progress to be made there. So I hope these comments have provided some overview of our report findings, and I want to turn it over to Wendy and our discussants to dig much more deeply into some of these issues from missions perspectives, and also to turn it over to our participant from the Mukwege Foundation to really give us a perspective of how all this should look from a survivor-centered approach. Over to you, Wendy.
Thank you so much, Lauren. So many very important findings coming out of the report, especially, you know, obstacles to participation of women in early warning networks. And this is really a theme that cuts right through the WPS agenda. The importance of female peacekeepers and mixed engagement teams, and then some of the tools and systems used for tracking and engaging, and some of the challenges that they face. I'd like to introduce the discussants for the discussion section of today's events. First, we'll have Ms. Desanges Kabuo, who's from the Dr. Denis Mukwege Foundation, Nobel Prize winning, I may add, and specifically from the SEMA Global Network of Victims and Survivors to End Wartime Sexual Violence. She will begin our discussion section. She'll be followed by Ms. Huma Khan from UNMISS, Ms. Beatrix Attinger Colijn from MINUSCA, and Ms. Gillian Kitley from MONUSCO. So with no further ado, I'd like to just start off our question for Ms. Kabuo. What impact does conflict-related sexual violence have on individuals and on communities? And how do you think these impacts affect the prospects for peace and security in the Democratic Republic of Congo? Over to you, Desanges. Desanges, just a moment. Can you unmute yourself so we can hear you? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, perfect.
Merci beaucoup. Merci. Pour ce qui concerne les impacts qui affectent vraiment les perspectives de la paix et la sécurité en RDC, moi, j'aimerais dire que tout d'abord, nous avons des conséquences liées aux violences sexuelles. La première conséquence, c'est la conséquence psychologique. Quand je parle de conséquences psychologiques, là, je vois les traumatismes. Quand la femme est traumatisée, quand il y a une victime ou une survivante qui est traumatisée, alors comment elle va gérer sa famille, comment elle va gérer sa communauté? Là, elle est sous-estimée. Là, directement, on se sent qu'on est pointé du doigt. Tout le monde n'est pas d'accord avec tout ce que la survivante doit faire. Il y a les conséquences physiques. Quand je parle des conséquences physiques, je vois vraiment les maladies, les différentes maladies que la survivante trouve. Par exemple, les maladies, les infections sexuellement transmissibles, les VIH-Sida, les fistules, les prolapsus, les cancers du col de l'utérus, il y a les troubles mentaux et tout ce que je ne parle plus. Alors, quand on est malade, comment on va gérer la communauté? Comment on va gérer sa famille? Comment on va s'en occuper? Je vais parler aussi des enfants fruits du viol, qui sont une bombe à retardement. Et d'ailleurs, je peux mettre un sujet dans ces conséquences parce que ça joue aux conséquences physiques, mais aussi ça va jouer sur les conséquences sociales, car la communauté dans laquelle nous vivons, ils ont des noms, ils appellent ces enfants enfants serpents. Comment alors ces enfants peuvent grandir correctement? Ce sont des bombes à retardement que la société crée et que notre gouvernement ignore encore. Ces enfants vont se mettre à l'écart, ils vont créer leur couple et puis peut-être voudront se venger un jour sur ceux qui les stigmatisent. Au final, quoi qu'il arrive, ça retombera aussi sur nous en tant que leur mère, en tant que leur maman. À ce qui concerne les conséquences sociales, à ce point, il y a la stigmatisation des survivantes dans la communauté. C'est-à-dire, nous sommes vraiment rejetés. Nous sommes vraiment rejetés à notre propre sort. Nous avons peur de participer même à différentes réunions ou d'avoir une vie sociale comme des autres. Vous savez, comme on dit, éduquer une femme, c'est éduquer toute une nation. De même que violer une femme en utilisant le viol comme arme de guerre, c'est violer toute une nation. Vraiment, dans notre pays, il n'y a pas la justice. Alors, comment pouvons-nous nous sentir à l'aise? Donc, quand on arrête un bourreau ici chez nous, parfois même, les bourreaux se retrouvent dans les quartiers quelques jours après en train de déambuler. Nous avons maintenant peur de dénoncer le mal. Quelquefois, vous allez rencontrer, il y a des familles de survivantes qui préfèrent mieux faire l'arrangement à l'amiable que d'aller perdre leur temps à la justice qui ne va pas aboutir. C'est terrible. Donc, vous comprenez que ça affecte le retour de la paix parce que l'on vit dans un pays où c'est l'impunité qui règne. Mais aussi, nos propres familles, au lieu de nous soutenir alors qu'on a été victime, elles nous rejettent comme si nous étions responsables de ces atrocités, comme si nous étions responsables de ce qui nous est arrivé, comme si nous étions responsables de ces viols et violences sexuelles qu'on a vécues. Elle rejette même nos enfants. Il les nomme de n'importe quel nom. Ça, ce n'est pas vraiment sérieux. Pour ce qui concerne les conséquences économiques, moi, je rappelle que la psychologie va toujours de pair avec les finances. Quand on est violé, quand on s'est violé, là, on n'a plus l'espoir de vivre. Quelquefois, nos bourreaux même, ils nous violent et ils volent nos biens. Comment alors nous allons vivre? Comment? C'est difficile de vivre. C'est difficile de vivre sans économie. Donc, c'est un peu ça, les conséquences qui se trouvent dans les systèmes de violence sexuelle. Et ça impacte vraiment la paix et ça impacte vraiment toute une communauté. Pour la deuxième question, donc, vraiment, tout d'abord, j'aimerais dire que la mission de la MONUSCO, c'est le maintien de la paix en République démocratique du Congo. C'est ça leur mission. C'est ça votre mission. Alors, la MONUSCO est chez nous depuis maintenant 20 ans. Donc, moi, j'avais que 10 ans quand la MONUSCO était arrivée ici au Congo. Le premier conseil que je peux donner à la MONUSCO est de rétablir la confiance avec la population et surtout avec nous, les victimes de violences sexuelles, parce que nous n'avons plus confiance à la MONUSCO. Nous connaissons beaucoup de cas de femmes qui ont été violées et violentées par les agents de la MONUSCO. Tout le monde en parle. Il n'y a pas de procès aussi. On sait bien que ces gens ou ces agents de la MONUSCO rentrent dans leur pays. Parfois, ils laissent même leurs enfants nés de leur viol et de leur violence ici chez nous. Donc, finalement, il y a l'impunité pour nos miliciens qui nous attaquent et qui nous violent, mais aussi, nous constatons qu'il y a vraiment qu'il existe l'impunité aussi de la MONUSCO, parce qu'ils violent aussi. Nous, en tant que victimes de ces atrocités, nous avons besoin de la justice et nous avons besoin de pouvoir faire confiance à ces gens qui sont censés être là pour nous protéger. La MONUSCO est là pour nous protéger parce qu'ils viennent de l'étranger pour nous protéger. Et c'est ça, c'est selon leur mandat et leur mission, je pense. Vous devez écouter ce que nous demandons. Vous, attaquez MONUSCO, vous devez écouter ce que nous, les survivantes, nous demandons. Ce n'est pas normal que lorsque les villages continuent à être attaqués et violés pendant 20 ans, sous vos yeux, donc sous les yeux de la MONUSCO, sans votre intervention, ce n'est pas normal. Et là, c'est terrible. Et là, ça fait mal au cœur. Et puis là, vous voulez qu'on se mette ensemble pour dire comment vous voulez nous aider. Oui, ok. C'est possible. Et donc, il faut d'abord faire en sorte que l'on puisse à nouveau vous faire confiance, vous attaquer MONUSCO. Établissez donc un cadre de dialogue avec nous les survivantes. Ça, c'est la première des choses. Ensuite, le conseil que je pourrais encore vous donner, moi, en tant que survivante, si vous voulez une approche victimo-centrée, où la victime est au centre de tous les débats, c'est beau. C'est beau. Nous avons aussi besoin de ça. Alors, il faut que la MONUSCO puisse lancer des programmes qui vont permettre de faciliter des établissements d'un tribunal pénal international au Congo pour juger les auteurs de crimes, comme l'avait fait avec les rapports mapping. Je sais que vous êtes vraiment à ce point, c'est vous qui êtes au niveau de lancer un tribunal pénal international au Congo. Nous avons besoin de ça. Parce que ces rapports étaient nous très appréciés. Et avec ça, on sait que l'on va pouvoir lancer des procès. Autre chose, que la MONUSCO puisse collaborer avec nous pour répertorier toutes les victimes et pour faciliter la réception des réparations. Si un jour ça aura lieu, parce que nous, on ne sait pas, que aussi la MONUSCO puisse aider à récolter les témoignages dans une base de données fiable. Nous voulons aussi qu'il y ait plus de femmes pour nous accueillir et dialoguer avec nous pour que l'on se sente plus à l'aise, nous, en tant que survivantes. Nous voulons aussi qu'il y ait plus de casques bleus féministes, qu'il y ait plus de casques bleus femmes pour lutter contre les violences sexuelles que la MONUSCO aussi fait. Donc, qu'il y ait aussi un travail en association avec des équipes qui pourront nous soigner et nous prendre en charge en urgence en kit PEP. Les kits PEP, là, c'est un médicament qui empêche les VIH-Sida, les grossesses non désirées, et ça permet, dans moins de 72 heures, d'éliminer tout ce qui peut arriver. Que la MONUSCO organise des ateliers de sensibilisation pour qu'on explique à nos communautés qu'ils n'ont pas droit de nous stigmatiser parce que ce n'est pas de notre faute. On ne s'est pas fait violer. Ce n'est pas vraiment de notre faute. Qu'il y ait aussi un espace pour enfants, pour lutter contre les stigmatisations de ces enfants fruits du viol. Un espace avec soit des jouets, un espace où on va avoir des assistantes psychosociales, un espace où on va avoir soit des formateurs dans différents métiers pour préparer leur vie future. Donc, ça doit être, par exemple, un espace comme la cité de la joie de Bukavu, qui va permettre à ces enfants fruits du viol à se sentir vraiment à l'aise et ils ne seront plus stigmatisés. Je vais aussi demander à la MONUSCO qu'il y ait des programmes pour l'encadrement des jeunes afin de lutter contre les viols et violences sexuelles parce que, avec le contexte de guerre ici chez nous, donc dans laquelle nous vivons, les jeunes vont recopier ce qu'ils ont toujours vécu. S'ils ne sont pas alors occupés, ça sera maintenant un cercle vicieux et la société là sera vraiment détruite de plus en plus. Je demanderai aussi à la MONUSCO qu'il y ait un centre de formation professionnelle des survivantes de violences sexuelles. Et ces centres, moi je demanderai que c'est la survivante elle-même qui sera au centre de toutes les activités. Une autre chose, il faudrait que la MONUSCO pense à ces groupes armés qui sont toujours dans la forêt, juste à côté de chez nous, et qui nous mettent à danger tous les jours. Vraiment, que la MONUSCO pense à ces groupes armés qui sont dans des hauts plateaux, qui sont dans des forêts. C'est un peu compliqué ici chez nous. Que la MONUSCO aussi pense, à dernier lieu, à la protection des défenseurs des droits humains, plus particulièrement celles qui risquent leur vie chaque jour en train de travailler avec nous, les survivantes de viols et violences sexuelles. Donc, c'est un peu ça. Je vous remercie.
Ms. Kabuo, thank you so much for your intervention, and especially thank you very much for your courage to come and speak to all of us today about your experience and your advice, which couldn't be more important. You raised so many very important issues that I would really like the remaining speakers and those who have questions to consider. You know, the psychosocial, the economic consequences and the marginalization which results from the stigma that you discussed, the consequences of impunity, the lack of justice and accountability for perpetrators, and how failures of the justice system can have actual intergenerational impacts on the children of survivors. And then you moved on to really the next thing we wanted to discuss, which was advice for the UN on how to implement a survivor-centered CRSV approach, something that's outlined in many mission mandates, and what a CRSV approach should look like. What should the mission be doing to implement this sort of approach? And you raised many issues there about really prioritizing protection for UN missions, about community engagement, how it's key to addressing impunity, and how establishing trust among populations is really critical in this work. I'd like now to ask Ms. Huma Khan, who's the Senior Women Protection Advisor from the UN mission in South Sudan, to share with us some of your thoughts on how what CRSV can look like from the mission perspective, and what should the UN be doing to implement it. Over to you.
May I ask you to repeat the question? The internet is a little bit unstable.
Sure. So the UN stresses a survivor-centered approach to CRSV. It's a principle that is appearing in many peacekeeping mission mandates. What should a survivor-centered approach to CRSV look like? What should the UN be doing to implement it?
Thank you. In the context of peacekeeping, when I speak from the experience that we've had in South Sudan, I can give some examples of how survivor-centered approach is implemented in the mission here. One issue that was discussed earlier was related to early warning, which to include women's voices in early warning, that is something that has been done now more consistently. Not everywhere still, but it's been much more consistent than before. And that impacts our patrol planning, because now for last year, year and a half, we have a lot more flexibility from the side of force. So whenever we receive information from women, we try to redirect our patrols in accordance with what information they share with us. So if they share information of threat to rape or someone who's been raped, then we try to see how we could patrol those areas quicker and faster, and to secure those roads from time to time. We had an incident in a place called Bentiu in South Sudan in 2018, where we had large number of rape cases. This year, early March, April, we had similar situation, but just using the networks that we have developed for information, we were able to redirect patrol planning in a way that we could at least contain that. I would not say that we are able to ever completely stop it, but contain, and we did not reach as high numbers as before. In terms of, again, another example of survivor-centered approach it comes from a region of South Sudan where we had large-scale abductions of women and girls by one particular armed group. And they were taken young, and then many of them became sex slaves. Many of them, the story that Rania narrated before sounded very familiar. Once we got to know, we started engaging with the leadership of the armed group and also the commanders on the ground. It took us almost a year to negotiate their releases. So when we reached the final stage of their releases, with a lot of help from peacekeepers, different components of the mission, we decided to allow women a space with Catholic Church, who is the most trusted entity in that area and who worked with us in the partnership, to allow them about a 2-week period to go through trauma healing workshop that we supported to the church, and then to decide who wants to go back, who wants to move ahead. And what we got from a number of women was that we don't feel comfortable leaving now because there is too much international presence, and even those that, and some of them who also had formed unions even by force that they got used to, and they wouldn't want to leave those unions because they had children from those unions or any other consideration. And we decided to respect their decisions. So when we finished that 2-week workshop, we actually did not have many women leaving the camp immediately. There were very, very few. But after that, in months to come, there are a number of more women who have left those bases, and they are now moving to civilian lives. We are also supporting them on trauma healing and livelihood support from using a grant from European Union. So, and working with a national partner who would deliver that. So using survivor-centered approach, again, this is another example because from our side, we arranged everything. Even the leadership of the group was adamant that everybody should be released. But when a number of women decided they don't want to go like that, we respected and said, whatever is your decision is the best decision for you. Decide for yourself. So that's another example I'm just giving of survivor-centered approach in terms of how the mission reacts. I know that when it sounds more like UN agency work, and when people look at peacekeepers, we don't necessarily associate survivor-centered approach with peacekeeping missions, but it's not true, because we use a lot of survivor-centered approach in the way we also do advocacy, and the push for accountability, which we all agree is necessary. But even when we push cases through the justice chain, we make sure that the survivor is absolutely comfortable and has all the witness protection measures that are possible in this context. And at any point, if she decides to withdraw, which happens, we make sure that she's not pressured by anybody across the spectrum, because there are many actors that get involved in the process. And often in South Sudan, when survivors decide to withdraw at a certain point, it's always interpreted as, oh, they were lying, that's why they decided to withdraw. That's very common amongst prosecutors, lawyers, even politicians. They love this kind of opportunity. But taking all that blame, we still make sure that if she feels that she should withdraw, then she should have the right to withdraw and should not be pressured to proceed with the case. And that unfortunately happens here quite often. Another new approach that we have taken recently in using survivor-centered approach is to build networks of survivors. And this is, again, we are doing it through support from PBF, Peace Building Fund, in 2 of the hotspots of the country, where we are trying to build survivors network. And these survivors networks are not necessarily only sexual violence survivors, because that becomes also stigmatizing if you name it a network of sexual violence survivors, but conflict survivors, which include men and women, but we make sure that sexual violence survivors are included, to provide them a support network from each other and also through the local partner that we work with. We also look at it as a process, because we are in the process of implementing the peace agreement. And eventually, with all the reluctance, we will reach a stage where we will have to implement the transitional justice chapter of the peace agreement. And we are also looking at the survivors networks as the ones taking lead when that process begins, to bring in their voices to the discussion. How do they perceive transitional justice or justice itself? Because the way we perceive justice is often also very much from our point of view or from the politician point of view of justice, and not necessarily always survivors have the same view. For them, regaining their lives back seems much more the broader concept of justice, which is not limited to prosecution. So also trying to inform the peace agreement and implementation of the peace agreement through these survivors networks of the understanding that survivors have of justice. These are some of the examples perhaps that I could share of using survivor-centered approach. I hope that gives a clear picture of how the mission does it.
Thank you so much, Ms. Khan. Both you and Ms. Kabuo raised a number of issues about including women's voices in early warning, about more women and in peacekeeping forces and training and sensitization with youth and survivor skills training and protecting human rights defenders, points that Ms. Kabuo raised, and your points about building survivors networks and how these can be leveraged in, for example, the South Sudan peace process is one that I think has lessons for other peace operation contexts as well, and the importance of building the network and drawing on psychosocial support and assisting those survivors through the justice system. I'd like to now turn to Ms. Gillian Kitley, who is the Senior Women Protection Advisor in MONUSCO, the UN mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Ms. Kitley, could you help us answer the question about how peacekeeping missions can both effectively and equitably engage women and men to inform strategies for CRSV prevention? And how can they adjust their practices to make sure that they're better engaging survivors and witnesses?
Thank you, Wendy. Just like to say also thank you to Ms. Kabuo for your intervention. We are very sensitive to the concerns that you raise, and also very much welcome the suggestions that you have about how we can better support survivors and what we can be doing, including in South Kivu, where I am at the moment. But to speak a bit about how we are trying to more effectively engage women and men to inform our strategies on prevention. Of course, the information we receive from men and women is different, and for many reasons linked to culture and inequality in the environment in which we work. The voices of men tend to dominate, and so we have to make a concerted effort to ensure that the voices of women are heard. Given that our mandate, the strategic priority is the protection of civilians, this is very important, and it's particularly important when we're gathering information about conflict-related sexual violence. The strategies that we develop in MONUSCO for CRSV prevention are informed by information that's collected by all components of the mission, the uniformed and civilian components, and it's assessed through a field-level mechanism. And we in the Joint Human Rights Office have the lead in terms of information gathering and assessment. But we depend on the information gathered by all components in order to have a full picture of what is happening on the ground and to be able to develop a response strategy. And there are ways in which we're trying to make sure that we engage more with women. For example, starting at the base, our civil affairs section works with women, civil society organizations, women leaders in conflict affected areas to strengthen their capacity to identify CRSV risks, and to share alerts of risks safely with community alert networks who transmit the information to civil affairs officers and to us. Our human rights and our protection networks also include women, and these networks are usually based in remote areas that we don't have easy or quick access to. So it's really important that they also include women and report information that's specific to women's protection. When we deploy human rights monitoring, assessment, or investigation missions, we meet with women and women's associations, as well as with men. And these meetings are organized at times and locations when women can most easily participate. And in terms of other parts of the mission, the Joint Mission Analysis Cell has diversified its networks in the last couple of years to ensure that the analysts are speaking not only with men, but also with women, and that they're taking into consideration the perspectives of women when they collect information. Peacekeepers are also making more efforts to engage with women during community engagement activities. We know that women are usually more comfortable speaking to women than to men. And also, this concerns women in uniform. And to respond to this concern, we're seeing more female peacekeepers being deployed and also more women being involved in community engagement activities. I want to mention the deployment of female engagement teams, and we now have around 14 female engagement teams in the DRC. And these are directly involved in community outreach activities. And as Lauren mentioned, the work of these teams is particularly important when the troops are deployed to remote areas. And they're usually deployed to these areas because they're at high risk, including high risk of CRSV. And they can help reach out to the population about protection threats and CRSV incidents. They work through community liaison assistants who act as interpreters and support them in interacting with the local population in their own languages. And now around 30% of these community liaison assistants are women, following a push to try and increase the percentage of women over men and CLAs. However, just because a peacekeeper is a woman doesn't mean that she knows automatically how to engage with local women, and particularly how to engage on sensitive issues like CRSV. So it's really important that peacekeepers, men and women, receive training before they're deployed and also after they're deployed on how to do this and what they should do and what they shouldn't do. We have provided some training to peacekeepers on this specific issue. And we've also developed pocket cards with the Force Gender Advisor, which act as a quick guide for peacekeepers. And these cards explain how to identify and react to potential cases of CRSV, or what peacekeepers can do, such as collecting basic information about location, information around the incident have taken place, so that they can report this to women protection advisors, human rights officers who can follow up and refer, find ways to refer victims for medical care and other kinds of care. But it also explains what they shouldn't do, such as directly interviewing potential victims or including any information about their identity in reports that could be made public. So these are some examples of how we're trying to make sure that we engage more equally with men and women. It's an ongoing challenge. It takes time to change a culture. In a context like the DRC, we still need to do more. And as a last point, I think it's also important to remember that CRSV does affect men and boys. And we need to make sure that we tailor our engagement with communities to be sensitive to the barriers to reporting sexual violence against men and boys, so that we also document these cases and provide assistance to male and boy victims. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Kitley. So many interesting and very important points you raise about information gathering from all of the mission components and how essential that is, about the importance of engaging with women leaders in conflict-affected communities, and the importance of how to do proper training and ensure that that there are community liaison assistants who speak the local language and can engage local communities on their own terms in their own language, which really helps with community engagement on these issues, and the importance of data protection. Now, deep diving a little bit more into some of these technical issues about how this work is carried out at the mission level, I'd like to ask Ms. Beatrix Attinger Colijn, from the Senior Women Protection Advisor from the UN mission in the Central African Republic, to elaborate on this point about how does mission reporting and analysis incorporate CRSV and sex aggregated data. And then Gillian, will come back to you to see if you want to add a few comments onto that same question as well. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Wendy. And thank you to Lauren and CIVIC, of course.
Beatrix, I'm afraid I can't hear you.
Okay, I have unmuted. I have unmuted. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, probably takes some time. Thank you very much. Thank you, Lauren, and of course, CIVIC, for the report. Shedding light on our work, especially when it comes from outside, is also very helpful. And I would like to come to your question. When it comes to sex disaggregated information, I think the mission does very well, all the mission components, in all the events that they do, sensitization, training, to disaggregate female and male participation, so that we know very well who are our stakeholders that are participating in our activities. When it comes to CRSV, it's a bit more complex. And there I just have to say, well, we are a relatively young mission, but you have to look at where each person, each staff member, staff officer works, what their type of work is, what they're actually monitoring, and then see how this overlaps with what we want them to see and to report on. So, and see there if there is an entrance where you can kind of redirect focus. In practice, human rights officers, of course, they are monitoring conflict-related violations, human rights violations, and they're very well aware how to analyze and how to report on conflict-related sexual violence, and they do that very well. But when you then go to UNPOL, for example, they are, of course, supporting the national gendarmerie and police to monitor crime in general. So that's their main focus. So there we have to see how can they really go into details that we can use their information to do more analysis. I have to say I have a very, very close cooperation with UNPOL. We are really privileged to have the Rapid Intervention Unit, the National Police Station in Bangui, that is there for sexual and gender-based violence. So the awareness is really mission-wide that we're looking at sexual and gender-based violence. We get a lot of information and then we sit together to do the smaller analysis, what actually was conflict-related sexual violence and where, and do the mapping. And this works very well with UNPOL. When we then come to the force, or let me say first to the military observers, they go out and they look at the general security situation. They talk a lot to the population about food, about security, about what is happening, and they often collect information on sexual and gender-based violence. But they might not be asking the second question, who was the perpetrator? Is this conflict related? They might not put it in the context. That is for us very important to know. So again, Gillian has also referred to pocket cards. We have pocket cards for the referral of victims, that if they do have information that they can ask the question, you know, has the victim actually received help, and was the victim referred to medical or psychosocial care, and then get to the secondary information maybe. Then it comes to the force, those that do just the patrols. This was also mentioned by Desanges, actually, they have been very much trained to look at incidents or possible incidents of sexual exploitation and abuse committed by peacekeepers or humanitarian actors. And it's not in them that immediately they also add on to see that we also need to monitor what's happening in the community itself with perpetrators from the community or from the armed groups. So again, there we need to step in and basically redress a little bit the focus and add an extra focus to what they're doing. And the best is always when this is done really on a local level in the field missions and the field offices, that really this kind of exchange of information is happening on a local level. And in some of the field offices, military observers and human rights officers, they talk on a daily basis and they exchange, we've heard this, maybe you can go and investigate. So that's always the best when it happens on the local level, because then you have also real-time involvement and you can have a response in real time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Attinger. Colijn. Gillian, do you want to come in on this point to elaborate on some of the issues that she raised about working with UNPOL, about information sharing, doing joint analysis?
Sure, thank you. MONUSCO does largely incorporate CRSV and sex disaggregated data now in most of its internal reporting and analysis. Most of the internal reports on POC are based on the information provided by the different components. And there has been guidance and instructions, I should say, from the top of the mission, from the SRSG and others, that this needs to include CRSV and we must disaggregate data. And this has resulted in a big improvement in terms of the reporting. It's really important that reporting guidelines is based on policies and directives and not just on the views of individual heads of component about whether or not it's important. It's particularly important, I think, to have leadership in the force on this issue. Also, given that there's frequent redeployments of battalions of the force and changes in leadership. So this kind of instruction needs to be integrated into the policies and the practices of the force as well as the other components. In general, the daily reports from our offices, from the field offices, include CRSV and disaggregate data, as do the reports from the JOC and the analytical reports of JMAC. In addition, we in the Joint Human Rights Office provide detailed reports of conflict-related sexual violence and patterns of sexual violence, which include data analysis, and these include findings from special investigations, as well as summarized information from these investigations is included in mission-wide reporting and is also included in public reporting that our office does. We issue monthly public reports, which includes disaggregated data and has a special section on CRSV. In 2019, we launched SAGE in MONUSCO, which also features in the report, CIVIC's report. And this is a mission-wide database in which all POC-related incidents are recorded. And this is used for reporting and for analytical purposes. In the development phase of SAGE, POC advisors, human rights officers, and women protection advisors were all consulted on how to revise initial data entry forms to make sure that they recorded separately POC incidents relating to women, girls, including CRSV. And as a result, I think the reporting, internal reporting in MONUSCO has improved significantly in this area. Gender is a mandatory field in all reporting. There's of course also the MARA, the UN-wide monitoring and reporting arrangements that were established by the Security Council in Security Council Resolution 1960. And as Lauren mentioned, there's been a concerted effort to try and improve the MARA in the last few years. We chaired the MARA and we've expanded membership to include all components of the mission as well as UN agencies and funds and programs. And we collect and verify information from across the UN within the MARA. We have a specific database on conflict-related sexual violence. And we use the information from this database for our monthly reports as well as other public reporting. We have monthly meetings at the MARA, which we present analysis and the data from the database, discuss with all the participants the trends and developments, and also look at where we see gaps, including in provision of assistance to victims of conflict-related sexual violence. For example, after the pandemic hit and a state of emergency was imposed in the DRC, this had an impact on our ability to do monitoring in some areas. And we also found out that there were some areas which were not receiving PEP kits, so health centers not receiving PEP kits. And so women were not able to access medical care in a timely way. And through the MARA, we were able to identify a partner in the UNFPA that was able to fill this gap. So this is a really useful forum in which we can share information on analysis, but also look at where the priorities should be and where the gaps are. This also allows us to find solutions in other areas and also to make sure that our reach is beyond that of just MONUSCO, but that we can also reach out to other areas where MONUSCO is not present. So that's just a few points. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Kitley. I wondered if we could just do a quick tour de table of the Senior Women Protection Advisors to see if there are specific good practices that you could just raise that haven't already been shared. I mean, there are many points that you've just raised, Ms. Kitley, about mission components engaging with the other parts of the UN and the country team, and really shared information, analysis, and coordination on a single database and how that can be useful. But in general, are there good practices that missions have implemented to respond to CRSV that could be replicated that haven't already been raised in our discussion? I'll go to you, Ms. Khan, first, and then over to Ms. Attinger Colijn, and then Ms. Khan, if you'd like to, Ms. Kitley, if you'd like to come back in at the end and just raise a few. Are there any good practices that haven't already been raised about how responding to CRSV can be done at the mission level?
If I could come back later, would that be okay?
Sure, not a problem. Ms. Attinger Colijn, do you have any that you'd like to share?
Yes, I hope you can hear me. Yeah, good. Yes, something that our former force commander has always stressed for basically be mobile and reacting to what is happening was the regional JOCs, the Joint Operation Center that are in the field. That really the people, I mentioned it before, from the field offices on a very regular basis, on a daily basis, exchange information, and they can discuss what is really possible to do with the force that they have on the ground, with the security situation that is there. This is sometimes very difficult to decide from the capital. We're very far away, and until all the information is pulled together and we have a common decision, that already has cost so much time. So if this can be done in the field, that's very good. The MARA was also mentioned several times. We always have the MARA every month, but that's every month. So of course there needs to be an exchange in between as well. What we have done with the MARA, which helps a lot, is that we have extended membership. We extended membership ad hoc to our national protection network, the women that we have trained to be out there in the field, to do a lot of work, incredible work, what they're doing out there for us, that they can come and basically tell us what has happened and talk to each other, because we do the MARA even before we use Teams. We did the MARA with VTC, with all the field officers connected. So we have 12 field officers connected and the people can see each other. And that has immensely increased the information flow, and people feel connected, because sometimes when you're out there in the field, you're maybe very lonely and you're not sure whether what you're doing is really very relevant for the big people in Bangui. So when you connect the people and you also have additional people now and then, that really adds to the value of the information that is exchanged. We also invite ICRC as an observer. We invite actually every institution that is having a program on sexual violence somewhere to join us and also join the discussion. SAGE was mentioned. I'm very happy that in my mission also the SRSG now twice has said that everybody should use SAGE, and I hope that in the future, really when we have a representative number of information of incidents registered in SAGE and gone through and have the quality of what we want, that we can do a much better analysis and therefore also have better prevention. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ms. Kitley, anything to add?
Thank you. Just a couple of points. I think starting with the deployment of women protection advisors, I think it's really key to have women protection advisors deployed to field offices in areas where there is a prevalence of CRSV, so they can provide specific expertise and advice on setting priorities for deployment of the force into areas where there's a risk of CRSV or it's ongoing, as well as following up directly with police and military, national police and military when violations take place, and on engaging with provincial authorities and NGOs locally on strategies for prevention. You mentioned, Lauren, the development of these comprehensive action plans on CRSV. I think this is a good practice that we've been able to implement here in MONUSCO. And this was an action plan that brought together the different components of office in Bukavu here, military, civilian, as well as working with our UN colleagues, agencies, and national NGOs and provincial authorities to really apply all our efforts into addressing sexual violence that was taking place in an area which is about an hour's flight to the west of Bukavu, in quite a remote area. And the impact was to try, was one, to address the CRSV that was taking place, but also to try and strengthen state authority in the areas that they could take on protection, a stronger protection role, but also to try and stop the individuals who were actually committing sexual violence. And as you said, the impact was effective in terms of reducing CRSV in the months that followed the implementation of the action plan by 72%. But also, and this we consider like really a successful outcome, the arrest and prosecution of the armed group commander that was directly responsible for the violence, the sexual violence, who was convicted of crimes against humanity, is now serving life in prison. I mean, there's also a challenge associated with these action plans. It requires a lot of resources, and it's difficult to sustain them in the long term. We need a really strong national commitment to maintain and sustain the impact of these action plans, particularly in remote areas. I think another good practice is the ability to deploy very quickly and flexibly in response to alerts about sexual violence, including through the standard combat deployments, which is just a company of peacekeepers who can deploy in a matter of days. And this provides a strong protective environment. Another good practice, I think, is to support what we call one-stop centers for victims of sexual violence. And these are centers, they can be health centers, clinics, where women can go discreetly without drawing attention, but receive holistic support, including medical, psychosocial support, but also legal support so that they can pursue cases for justice for violations and violence has taken place. These one-stop centers are often in areas where there's not other kinds of support available, so they're really important. And lastly, I think one of the important or good practices that we try to pursue here is to make sure that there's a real continuity between the monitoring, the analysis that we do, and the pursuit of the perpetrators so responsible for sexual violence. So, we systematically raise the information, the cases that we have with judicial authorities, and we support them to conduct investigations in locations where events take place. And so that the victims and witnesses can participate, we make sure that they can participate safely in judicial investigations, that their identity is protected, and also in trials. So these trials are also conducted in or close to the locations where sexual violence has taken place, and have resulted in quite a high number of convictions, both of armed group combatants, but also of military and police for sexual violence. Of course, there's much more that we could do, and in a country the size of the DRC, it's challenging to really be able to cover effectively the area where sexual violence is taking place. But we will keep trying and keep trying to improve our responses and our capacity to prevent sexual violence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Kitley. I mean, some really good examples there about the one-stop centers and how this continuity between monitoring and analysis is really so important. Ms. Khan, do you have anything that you want to add in terms of best practices from South Sudan, which hasn't already been raised?
Thanks. A couple of things that I wanted to just mention. One is building national ownership. So we have a system of sharing cases on a monthly or quarterly basis with SSPDF, the National Army, and also with the police, which are against them. So we ask them to investigate, but we have a mechanism where we take whatever we receive, sometimes in terms of trends and sometimes in terms of cases, depending on what the survivor has agreed to share. But we make sure that we share it with them. We ask them for feedback on their internal investigations, basically not taking all the responsibility ourselves, but also building within themselves that it is their responsibility to address. We've also done joint patrols. So in Bentiu that I mentioned earlier, when we were trying to deter cases of sexual violence, we did joint patrols with the National Army, and that is something that we are doing in other places as well with peacekeepers, so that the responsibility is not only of the UN, but national government also takes the ownership and responsibility. So that's something I wanted to flag, because we are really trying to work hard to build national ownership of the issue and not to just leave it as an issue that is of foreigners. The other is the mobile courts, because South Sudan has a very weak justice system. So we've deployed with support from UNDP, jointly with UNDP and Ministry of Justice, we've deployed mobile courts to remote parts of the country, where many cases of sexual violence were prosecuted, because in the absence of courts and prosecutors in these areas, most of the cases, they don't go through justice system. So just to expedite and to set up examples, we also have been working on mobile courts to make sure that victims receive justice. And lastly, internally, we have liaison officers from, and we have a very close working relationship with Force HQ. Having a liaison officer in our team from has helped us bridge that, that quick information sharing and that quick coordination that we need, because ours is a huge, huge mission. So sometimes it becomes quite difficult to coordinate. So having someone seconded to women protection team from uniform components, that is another good practice that I would like to share that has helped us delivering our mandate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Khan. Also, I'm really very glad you raised the mobile courts, and that's really an interesting practice and one that is worthy of replication. I'd like to just take a few minutes now to respond to some questions that have come in from our participants, with much gratitude to those of you who've taken the time to pose them. I'll just share 3 questions now, and then we can see if we have time for one more round after that. And maybe I'll just turn to the 3 senior women protection advisors to add what you are able to the questions. Any of the other speakers are very welcome to come in on any of these points as well. The first is from Magento Pascaline, asking, what is the place that peacekeeping missions give to the victims in the prevention of violence in the DRC? So really about victim reparation. Maybe Ms. Kitley, you can come in on that in just a moment. Another question from Aubert Kadojo, asking about how missions can better engage with communities to improve their responses. This is really about community engagement and how that can be improved. And then a question from Joanne Sperancino, talking about information and discussion on CRSV reporting, what's being done in prevention and training to stop CRSV before it happens, and immediate consequences for these acts, such as dismissal. So if any of you would like to address those questions, maybe just a couple of words, and then we'll see if we can just get in one more round after that. Maybe starting with you, Ms. Kitley, and then we go to Ms. Attinger Colijn and Ms. Khan.
Thanks, Wendy. Could you repeat the question, please?
Sure. The question is, what is the place that peacekeeping mission gives to victims in the prevention of violence in DRC? So really, how does the mission engage with victims when it looks into investigations with verifying information and those issues?
So when we do our monitoring investigations, we go directly to the communities that are affected. We receive information through a variety of ways, some directly from the communities themselves, sometimes through NGOs that work with local communities. And then we conduct missions to those areas to try and gather information. And sometimes we will, again, directly contact victims of violations, including CRSV. It depends on the circumstances, and sometimes in order to not do harm, we will not directly contact individuals who have been victims of violations, including CRSV, because we don't want to draw attention to them. And it very much also depends on, we will consult the communities to see what they think is best, which approach is best. And also the victims themselves will be consulted so that it's up to them to decide whether or not they want to speak to us directly and how they want to do that, if so, and what kind of, we need to be able to provide a safe environment in which they can speak freely and without fear of reprisals or other reaction. And in terms of developing protection strategies, they are also involved either directly or indirectly in the development of protection strategies for their communities. And these are strategies that will be through a variety of means, but setting up early warning mechanisms and other kind of local protection strategies. But I say, our main concern in contacting victims is to see that they get assistance, particularly if it's women victims of sexual violence, that they receive medical assistance, other kinds of assistance, usually through referral channels, and not directly by us, but through NGOs and others who have the capacity to provide assistance. And then we will try and support them also to follow up their cases through the courts. I'm not sure that directly responds to the question, but I hope that's useful.
Thanks. I think that's very much what was being intended for the question. Ms. Attinger, Colijn, any responses to any of these questions? And then Ms. Khan, you can follow.
Yes, I would like to respond to how we engage with the communities. And there I would like to come back to the project that I have already mentioned, the National Protection Network, which, by the way, we were able to develop this with a UK grant from OHCHR. So thank you very much to the UK. It has two parts. One is the National Protection Network, where we have appointed people in the different field offices in the different cities that work very closely with us on an ad hoc basis. But they are very, very important for us because they are the ones that can also do risk assessments for us on a local basis. And human rights officers, but also other sections, they work with their own people on the ground and trying to analyze and make these risk assessments. Our protection network in one of the places where we had the rapid intervention unit, the UMIR, going last August to investigate conflict-related sexual violence incidents. They actually registered 264 cases there with the support of UNPOL. But before they interviewed the victims, there was a risk assessment done by our members from the National Protection Network. And they were actually seeing whether the victims would run any risk by speaking to the police and basically tell about their case. The second part of this project is that we're currently running 2 shelters for security, for people, for women, for victims of sexual violence who need some time away from their normal home until basically their case has been sorted out. These shelters are run by national NGOs. Again, we're not interfering. We basically let them do the whole referral in the community. And they have, over the year that this now has been running, done amazing work with really finding also through other women's associations, people who need their help and who have then basically benefited from being in a shelter for a certain time and have been assisted during that time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Ms. Khan, just conscious of the time, do you have just a few words before we do a last round of closing remarks to the other speakers who haven't been able to speak yet? I'll turn to Ms. Spink, Ms. Quinn, and Ms. Kabuo for any final thoughts. But Ms. Khan, please, if you have anything to add to these questions, the floor is yours.
Just in terms of working with communities, I gave a few examples before. Working with faith-based groups, particularly church in the context of South Sudan, has been quite significant on addressing stigma and preventing sexual violence. So church in South Sudan and other religious groups have been our core partners in trying to address stigma and creating space for survivors of sexual violence in the community. So I just wanted to briefly mention that they have been a key partner for us.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Ms. Quinn, do you have any thoughts on any of the very rich discussion? It's really impossible to summarize, but any closing thoughts before we wrap up today? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Wendy, and thank you to our 4 discussants. I mean, I don't think there is very much of value I can add compared to the very rich contributions they've brought from the field, but there are 3 reflections I would have on what we've heard from them, I think. The first of which is, as I was sitting here thinking back to 2012 when the UK launched the Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict initiative, I thought, well, we have come a long way and we should recognise that. And I recall at the time there were some sceptical voices who said, you know, preventing sexual violence in conflict, what next? Would prevent death in conflict? And there was this sense that somehow CRSV was inevitable and it was just a fact of life in any conflict setting. And I think we should recognise we've come a really long way now, and we know what the practical tools are that can help prevent it, that can help tackle it and provide redress and accountability. And we know now that survivors have to be at the centre of everything we do, and we have to respect their agency, including, as some of our discussants have said, when they say that they don't want to take forward a proceeding, or when they say, actually, no, we know ourselves best what will protect us and what will enable us to recover from what has happened to us. And we also know how to address the root causes that lead to women and girls in particular being more vulnerable to sexual violence in conflict. And so while it's incredibly important to think about prevention and to think about accountability, we also have to look at this, I think, in a holistic sense in the round and think about what can all actors, whether it's peacekeeping missions, civil society organizations, host states, international partners do to really address the root causes and empower women and girls more in their societies. The second reflection I had is around the importance of data, coming back to what I said at the beginning. And I think we've heard really powerfully today about what a difference it can make when peacekeeping missions work in a joined up way across silos, when all the components of a mission have robust data that enables them to understand the threats against civilians. That data has to include the voices of women and girls in the field and the essential role that particularly protection advisors can play in joining up the dots and making sure that missions have that broad situational awareness. And I would highlight here, I guess, the importance of the peacekeeping intelligence policy that was promulgated last year, and also the 2019 update of DPO's protection of civilians policy, both of which I think really bring through the importance of that situational awareness intelligence picture. And then my last reflection, and particularly listening to what Desanges was saying, was around the fact that, you know, this is everybody's business. And it's very refreshing for me, as I'm sure it is for many of us, to be on a panel with all women today. But of course, you know, the WPS agenda is not just a matter for women. Preventing sexual violence in conflict, advancing the WPS agenda in field missions is not just for female peacekeepers. It's not just for female leaders or for female protection advisors. It's the business of all of us. And so I think while it's really important that we continue our efforts for gender parity in peacekeeping deployments, that we recognize the value that, for example, mixed engagement teams bring, we can't ever give in to the temptation to assume that preventing sexual violence in conflict is somehow a job for the women in peacekeeping to do, or a job for just women's organizations in civil society to do. It's got to be something that is everyone's job. And I just wanted to finish by reflecting on something Desanges said in that respect, which is about the connection between this and sexual exploitation and abuse in field settings. And I think we have to recognize that both of these phenomena are rooted in the same causes, which is inequality, unequal power relationships, particularly between women and girls and men and boys. And when local populations and local communities see that there is sexual exploitation abuse, including by the very people who are meant to protect them, by peacekeepers or by other international actors, that will inevitably damage their confidence. So I think, Desanges, you made a very valuable point by bringing that up. And that's why I think we can't have this conversation about CRSV in isolation from other things that affect particularly women and girls like SEA, and why the zero tolerance approach to that in peacekeeping is so important. But that's more than enough from me, so I'll stop there. Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you so much, Caroline, for sharing those thoughts. Desanges, would you like to share any final thoughts before we close for today? And then I'll turn over to Lauren and then to Rania to close us out. Over to you, Desanges.
Merci beaucoup. Donc, ce que je voudrais augmenter est que la MONUSCO prenne en considération toutes nos recommandations. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much, Desanges. Lauren, over to you.
This has been a wonderful conversation to participate in and to listen to. Thanks all for the rich conversation. Just a final thought on our research. So I think the research primarily draws on interviews over the last year, but we've been subtly tracking these things for multiple years as we've done research. And what I've seen and what we show in the report, in almost every area we looked at, the peacekeeping missions have made progress. Whether it's recognition across mission personnel of the importance of responding to CRSV, whether it's actual policies and practices that say women need to be in the meetings, in the rooms, or whether it's the increasing use of things like firewood patrols and attempts to direct patrols to where and when CRSV might take place. We see policies on ensuring that support to trials by missions includes a certain number of CRSV cases and includes a certain number of female defendants and survivors. And I think, this is all progress. Of course, there's a lot of progress still to be made. And we also discuss that in the report. And I think I've highlighted some of the areas where progress still needs to be made in comments today. I'm certainly happy that we have Ms. Colijn and Khan and Kitley working in these missions to try and drive that progress forward. And glad to hear from them today about what they're doing and where the good practices are that can and should be replicated.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Ms. Dagash-Kamara, do you want to close us out with any final thoughts?
Thank you very much, Wendy. There's little to add to all these very rich and, more importantly, honest, I think, discussion that we had today. I'm once again grateful for CIVIC, not just for creating this space through your research, but also through this forum and giving us the time to reflect on where we are going well, Lauren, and also where we remain challenged. And I think that's really important as we attempt to course correct. On our side, I think there's a very important, element I'd like to flag. Communities are the backbone of our peacekeeping presences. They're the reason we're deployed, and they are the reason that we are there. And I think building the necessary trust, as was mentioned earlier, is what we are focused on. This is what every one of our civilian and troops and our uniformed are there doing. And we certainly welcome feedback on how we can course correct, as I've said, and I think we've done a lot together, and we will continue to focus on doing more so that we respond to this mandate and beyond it jointly across and through the integration of our components, police, military, and civilian, with civil societies. I started with our partners in the UN agencies and with host governments. And I think collectively, we are able to make a very big difference to Marie's life and to others. And thank you very much again, Wendy.
Thank you very much, Rania. And thank you all for staying with us. We've gone just a couple of minutes over time, but I think you'll agree it was well worth for such a substantive and rich discussion on such an important topic. We really explored in quite a bit of breadth and depth the impacts of conflict-related sexual violence on individuals, on communities, as part of these broader peace and security strategies, and most of all, the importance of a survivor-centered approach. So thank you very much all for joining us today. Thank you for all of our speakers and discussants who are able to share your time. Thank you especially to Ms. Kabuo for sharing your time and courage for joining us today. And we wish you all very well and wish you all to stay well. Thank you. Goodbye.